Hello, I'm Tom Foster. Welcome to this tutorial on drawing different facial types in comics. Um, we're just going to start out here by blocking out the basic proportions of the head. Now, there's a lot of tutorials, both online and in books, that are specifically designed to teach you the basic proportions of the head in a sort of classical sense. So we're not going to go too much into that here because the information is so widely available, and because this tutorial is so specifically designed for defining separate types of character. But it is very important to have a fundamental understanding of how the head is proportioned in order that you can exaggerate out from that kind of basic starting point. The more solid and believable your underlying structure, the more credible your character is going to be. What I'm doing here, I'm working in Photoshop, obviously, and I'm using a very kind of rudimentary process. I'm not getting particularly technical, partly for the ease of the viewer, but also just for my own personal preference. When it comes to drawing or painting on the computer, I prefer a simpler approach. So I've used my first layer there. I've just blocked out the very basic proportions of the head in a sort of gesture sketch drawing. And then in my second layer here, I'm able to take just a slightly darker grey and pick out some of the facial features a little bit more precisely and sort of draw them as opposed to just hinting at their impressions. That first layer is obviously very key in terms of determining the overall look of the head, much as a thumbnail drawing for a layout might help you invaluably throughout the course of plotting a comics page. Your initial proportional sketch of a figure, particularly in digital drawing, will make a huge difference as to how the overall finished result looks. You may end up finding that you need to tweak the proportions a little bit once you see them rendered a little bit more accurately. You might find that there are little proportional problems that you hadn't noticed in the impression sketch. But generally speaking, the end result will probably be not too dissimilar from what you started out with in its basic proportions. Now, I've got some reference material here, actors who share the facial qualities of the particular facial type that I'm aiming for here, which is a kind of fairly generic, kind of youthful, stereotypically heroic masculine figure. Basically a sort of romantic ideal, classical features. It may seem somewhat kind of, I don't know, it may not always seem the most sound social politics to have all your leading characters or heroic characters have these facial qualities, but it's not so much a kind of eugenics thing as being the result of trying to create something resembling a blank canvas of a character. The character should be pleasing to look at. There should be no obvious visual irritants to kind of to distract the eye, but also they should be relatable to the viewer. If this is your leading character, then it's the one that the reader is going to have to or going to be asked to relate to the most often. So trying to keep the features as sort of generic and classical as possible is more of an exercise in creating a sort of blank slate, but a blank slate that isn't boring. And the only really way you can have a blank slate of a face that isn't boring is to observe some of those kind of classical rules, because then you can have a face that still looks very nicely drawn and rendered and is visually appealing, but at the same time is not so distinctive and so kind of breathtakingly handsome or whatever that it brings the reader out of the story, because ultimately this is storytelling of one kind or another. Now, using like I say, very basic settings in Photoshop here. I've not got anything special on the go, really. I'm not using any special brushes. I'm just using the kind of default brush, because at this stage the rendering isn't massively important. This is more of a study than anything else. Oh, it's not a study technically, I suppose, because we're not using a specific subject, but it's an exercise in sort of proportion and characteristics rather than the finished product that would appear on the page. Now, our reference material here, as you'll notice, it's all kind of it's Sean Connery, Cary Grant, Matt Bomer, Timothy Dalton, all people who are thought of as being fairly, like I say, classically handsome. But I'm not leaning too specifically on any one of them, because any specific resemblance to one person will kind of bring the reader out of the story a little bit. So I'm trying to take the features of each of their faces that sort of seem to fit best with the character I'm trying to create, and mold something that is in some way or another unique, even if it is merely living up to fairly established ideals in terms of facial anatomy. We're now kind of moving into doing a little bit more in terms of rendering the face with lighting effects and things. Still picking up on little anatomical details. You'll notice that once you start to light the head and cast shadows on it, you start to figure out little anatomical inaccuracies. You quite often find that when you're shading a figure, particularly the face, is when the kind of weaknesses in your own understanding of anatomy become apparent. That's usually because the areas of the face, the way that the shadows play across the face, is largely dictated by the underlying structures, the bone structure, the muscle structures, and everything. And unless you have a fairly comprehensive understanding of those, your shadows will be very much guesswork, and will be based on what you think the head looks like rather than what the head actually looks like. Even when you source quite heavily from photo reference, you'll notice that quite often people who use photo reference very heavily, their faces look very referenced, but they don't necessarily look all that physically real. One of the main reasons being that people have a sort of have very specific assumptions about the way that the face is constructed, and even copying from something that they can see right in front of them, they will unconsciously invoke those misunderstandings into the face. One of the most common ones is when people are doing very referenced photo faces, they will delineate the top of the upper lip quite distinctly as a line of its own, and then the bottom line of the lip, which is what I'm currently rendering here, and then the lower lip. So you'll have three lines on the go essentially. You'll have the top of the upper lip, the gap between the lips, and then the line that delineates the lower lip. Now, typically, the top lip is almost invariably in shadow because of the angle. If you have a light source that's facing downwards like this, anyway. So what I'm doing here is I would suggest the upper lip with a thicker line to delineate it, and I wouldn't separate it from the gap of the mouth. The upper lip would be just a kind of area of shadow, and that gives you a greater sense of dimension, because it shows that you're thinking about the three-dimensional qualities of the face, and it is more accurate, even although it may seem on first appearance as if the lips are quite clearly delineated. In fact, there's very little in physical terms which does delineate the top or bottom of the upper and lower lip. They're quite they're, they're quite sort of congruous with the rest of the face. It's just because there's this slight uh, different coloration of the skin that gives the impression, and that's one of the reasons why people, I think, draw them so specifically. Anyway, that's all a bit dry and focusing very much on one specific aspect. Um, but it's one of those things that will make a big difference. But what's, I suppose, the important point is that you need to really think of the face as not just a collection of three-dimensional objects, but a three-dimensional object in and of itself. That's where a lot of the shading's coming in here. You'll notice I'm shading a lot more um, towards the lower half of the face, and that is because generally the face being a partially curved surface at least, and the light source being above the face in this instance, the face is always going to get subtly darker the further down it gets. And the way that one of the most effective ways to show this, and the way in which it sort of pretty much is shown in real life, is that the little areas of the facial anatomy which are defined on the surface of the face are more noticeably shaded. So the facial muscles around the jawline are picked out here, but not up towards the cheekbone, or rather the center of the cheekbone, because that area is closer to the light. It's more facing the light. As you get towards the back of the cheekbone and the other side of the face, the face starts to kind of curl away from the light, so the shadows become more pronounced. I tend to give the nose a fairly, sizable shadow, not disproportionately sizable, but a noticeable shadow, because it really helps sell the dimension on the face, and it adds a sort of touch of drama as well. But you should always be careful not to you should be careful to observe the rules of light and shade, and that the shadow from the nose is only ever going to really stick out on one side. It's either going to stick out at the bottom, or it's going to stick out along the edge of the nose. You're not going to have a shadow that that gets broader, really, as it emanates from the nose. Uh, with regarding this particular facial type, um, like I say, it's very much an exercise in subtlety and balance. If you want to suggest youth and fitness and all those things, then the nothing about the proportions of the face should stand out as being particularly odd, or misshapen, or asymmetrical, or nothing should really draw the eye too much. Everything should seem the right proportion from each other. This sort of suggests health and vitality, and in a in a very primitive and kind of inaccurate way suggests intelligence to some degree. I mean, it's obviously completely specious to suggest that the shape of the face denotes how intelligent or morally just a person is. But but if they have well proportioned features and a sort of a relatively serious expression on their face, somehow that does imbue them with a kind of authoritative quality. Um, it does. I mean, like I say, the social politics of it are potentially a little bit suspect, um, but they kind of the underlying. I mean, this could just as easily be a villainous character. I suppose that's the other side of it. But for some reason, the proportions of the face, well proportioned face, suggests authority. I suppose it's because genetically it suggests, breeding, um, good breeding, which relics of the past that you don't necessarily want to examine too closely when you're trying to create an easy to follow story and clearly delineated characters. However, it is worthy of investigating precisely why people tend to gravitate towards that kind of thing. Very slight tangent, I suppose. We, in order to better facilitate this tutorial, because a lot of it is simply watching me draw a face, which, I mean, that's all very well and good, and I'm sure it's plenty of fun for a small number of people. There's only so much detail I can go into about each of the individual features of the face in this particular example, because so much of it is a case of not creating anything particularly out of the ordinary. I mean, with the hair here, I suppose there is something new to say in that, well, I'm going for kind of obviously a sort of fairly old-fashioned hairstyle here, but it's but when drawing the hair, that's when you really get to be impressionistic at first. You can go in and put more detail in the hair, and in fact, a lot of artists do recommend that you spend time on the hair in order to create a sense of detail. Like when you get the opportunity to put in detail without detracting from an image, then quite often it's advisable to do so if you have the time. But with hair, one of the best ways to go about hair is to do it very impressionistically at first, particularly if you want it to be kind of shiny like this. You want to kind of block in areas of black and white. Now, those are not random. Those are based on again, a sense of the hair being a three-dimensional object. But if you're in any way uncertain about how to light the hair or render it, then your photo reference is your friend. Those photos that I've chosen as reference, as well as all being of a kind of particular facial type, the other quality that they all share is that they are all lit from roughly the same angle. That's very important when choosing photo reference because, as I say, the way that light affects hits the face and the way that the sort of substructures of the face cast their own little shadows and have their own little indentations is often where the credibility of the face falls apart for artists, because it demands that you have a very good and very well-rounded understanding of the three-dimensional shapes, not only of the face itself, but of all its underlying structures. And hair, of course, is composed of so many individual structures that it's almost impossible to chart purely from speculation. You have to have some. You don't necessarily have to have the photo reference right in front of you, but if you have to kind of study examples of how the face, how the hair looks under certain lighting conditions, and try and store and retain some of that information as best as possible. A lot of this is a case of retention of knowledge of facial anatomy and various things. I mean, a lot of these things are kind of shortcuts. You notice a lot of comic book artists in the 60s and 70s. A lot of their rendering of faces and hair were very, very similar. A lot of them based on that sort of John Romita and Kurt Swan and Neil Adams, those kind of comic book artists. They would often do a kind of just a sort of generic version of that. In fact, the Marvel House style for a good proportion of the 70s was essentially a kind of John Romita imitation, and a lot of that is about, you know, outlining the areas of the face in a certain way, having the eyes largely just a sort of small area of shadow, the eyebrows with a certain weight, a certain type of line used. That every face would be lit in, well, a similar style to this actually, except maybe without quite so strong shadows. And all the line weights and hairstyles and everything would be very much um, of the same type. And the reason for that, in case you're wondering why the video stopped here, that this was a small pause in the working process. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, there is a temptation to look at how other artists have rendered the face and just copy that rather than trying to approximate what the face actually looks like through an understanding of its fundamental structures. And that's what defines the difference between just an imitator of another artist and a genuinely kind of interesting and I guess dynamic artist in their own right, is that you will see that they are in their own way interpreting their understanding of what it is that they're drawing rather than just copying somebody else's understanding of it. Plus, once you place that into a context of uncharted territory, once somebody who's been copying a specific artist all their life has to suddenly draw something that artist never drew, their drawing skills fall apart a little bit. It's something I've seen quite often in people just starting out in comics. Their figure work and their face work will often seem relatively strong, but as soon as they have to draw something that's kind of an abstraction, like for example, if they have to draw a zombie character, then the rest of the characters in their story might look sort of relatively well structured and everything. Then as soon as they have to draw a zombie where there's no real life reference for that. Obviously, there's special effects, makeup, and everything, but it's something where they won't have this sort of instinctive build-up of shortcuts of how to draw the anatomy when it's altered like that, and suddenly their character drawing looks very ragged and undisciplined and disproportionate and everything, because they don't necessarily have the understanding of what it is that makes up the shapes of the body. Here I'm going in and I'm correcting some of the highlighting on the hair and the delineation of the hair, the way that the hairline is sort of the shape of the hairline, just based on a closer study of the photo reference. This is where adding that little bit extra detail, an extra bit of kind of finish, is important with the hair, because it really, you can still be vaguely impressionistic with it, but at the same time making those impressions a little bit finer and a little bit more nuanced will make all the difference between your hair looking like a very quick sketch and your hair looking like something that is very much a finished drawing. This is not necessarily a finished drawing, but it's far closer. With regards to the ear, I suppose that's something we could discuss. You'll notice that a lot more of the ear is in shadow than the sort of main part of the face. That's again because it's tending away from the light source. Our light source is, the sort of focus of our light source is kind of the forehead and the upper area of the cheek that's facing us, the right cheek of the character. So everything the further away you get from that, the more in shadow the face will be. It's quite a focused light source. It's very much a kind of spotlight on the face. And those having that much of the ear in shadow and having such a heavy shadow on the other side of the face is not always necessarily 100% accurate, but again it lends dimension to what is essentially a two-dimensional drawing. So it helps the credibility of the figure as a real shape that exists in some kind of physical world. Um, with the eyes, you'll notice I haven't drawn in the lower eyelid really. I've just kind of let the bottom of the eyeball merge into the face. That's very much another lighting consideration. The top of that eyelid will be very much facing the light source, so would be indistinct to the viewer. I mean, if you take a photograph and put it in Photoshop and just apply, the stamp filter to it, you'll get a sense of these kinds of things. The upper eyelid, the eyelash, the area between the eyebrow and the eye. A lot of that will be quite clearly in shadow, but the lower eyelid and will almost always be just sort of merge into the lighter area of the face. Here I'm just kind of trying to create a slightly impressionistic context for this head. Just drawing the head on its own is a little bit kind of makes the image seem a little bit empty. If I suggest that a neck and shoulders and some kind of atmosphere around the character, it just helps lend it a little bit of fullness as an image, I suppose, depth. Picking out the upper eyelid a little bit more. Drawing in Photoshop is kind of a new thing for me. I typically would do all this process on paper, but I suppose the big advantage of drawing in Photoshop is that you can correct proportional details of already rendered areas without having to completely redraw them. That seems like an obvious observation, but when you're drawing character studies and things like this, it can actually be immensely helpful, because so much of the process of character creation, particularly in the face, is relying on very specific proportion, and creating what seems to be a well drawn and very kind of classical looking face is very much a case of trying to get those things as exact and tight as possible, so that you don't look at somebody's work and go, well, their faces are a little bit awkward. The nose is varying in size from one panel to the next, or whatever. This one's pretty much coming to an end. We're doing 3 facial types here, so all in all, we're going to be spending about an hour and 25 minutes together. So look forward to that. You'll notice, as well as the photographs, I also have anatomical diagrams open in Photoshop. Typically, I wouldn't necessarily have all these things collated into one Photoshop file, but just for the purposes of this video, I thought it would be useful to just show all the reference in one place, rather than show me constantly opening and closing Google Images. So with just the faintest of impressions of the rest of the body, you can create quite a strong effect. Just demonstrating here how basic the process has been. Only 3 layers. One for the initial sketch, very rough sketch, another one to pick out all the individual forms, and one last one to show us what the kind of finished product looks like, in a way. Now, for this facial type, we're focusing on a larger face, a fuller face, of a more kind of heavy set character. And in this instance, because the face is very much, the shape of the face is very much governed by extra kind of masses that are surplus to the the kind of basic structures of the face, like the muscles and the skull. It kind of alters how we give a basic impression of the face quite considerably, and it can be difficult to figure that out precisely in advance, because no or very few anatomy books in it are going to give you an idea of how fat is stored on the face. It's something um, that's not really the subject of as much kind of academic record or artistic record, for that matter. So photoreference is usually even more important for characters like this. The shape of the jaw line, or the fat around the jawline, creates a very, very different impression, and can make the accuracy with which you render that can make all the difference in terms of how credible your character is. The upper half of the head is largely the same. The very little fat is stored, above the eyes. Essentially, that's all just kind of flush to the skull. So that remains relatively unaltered. The nose, again, unaltered. No fat's really stored on the nose. The eyes, a little bit, a little above the eyes. The sort of the kind of bags above and below the eyes do store a little bit of fat. So you'll notice that particularly when the character smiles, the lower eyelid will bulge out a little bit more. The cheeks obviously do store a fair amount of fat, and when the character's smiling, that creates almost a kind of square shape in the three-quarter profile of the lower half of the face. I'm using kind of a smaller, neater nose here, just because a tendency of artists when drawing larger characters like this is to quite often go for a bigger, more bulbous nose, which I don't think necessarily works as well. I think a sharper, more kind of I don't know, aquiline nose or Roman nose can be more effective, because those types of noses can be very expressionful, if that's a word. Expressive. There you go. Those kind of noses can be very expressive because you can peak the nostrils a lot more, and they also have that sense of sort of sharpness and kind of good proportion, and therefore some kind of sense of authority in a weird way. The bottom half of the face is the face, or the sort of around the jawline is where the fat most affects the structure of the face. You get this big mass that goes right from the bottom of the ear right to like it completely kind of saddles the chin in a way, and the chin now as a structure is no longer really an extension of the jaw. It's more of a it frames the mouth. It's more just framing the mouth area, because there is no distinct jawline anymore. So your tangential lines coming out from the chin are those that lead up to the kind of dimples of the cheek, and that's it pretty much. The ear obviously unaffected. But the back of the neck stores a fair bit of fat as well. Not always, but I mean, if you're creating a kind of big, imposing figure, that's a good area to sort of to flesh out, so to speak. This now, what I'm doing here is again doing my best to observe the three-dimensional nature of the head as a whole. Essentially, particularly with a very kind of kind of fatty head like this. Um, it is almost a sphere. Like it's not quite, but it's more spherical in nature. So it should be. It has a lot of the shading of it shares the same properties. You get a gradual fade from a big area of highlight through a sort of mid-tone in the uh, across the cheeks and lower lip and under the eyes and everything, down to quite a dense area of thick shadow at the uh, at, at the sort of double chin, uh, and that's in a way, you could take away some of those defining features there, and it would essentially be shaded like a ball. Um, I have exaggerated that shading just very slightly to add a sense of kind of drama and atmosphere, as I did with the previous one. But generally speaking, I try and the keep things the lighting relatively accurate. These facial types that I'm using here, again, not leaning too heavily on any one or the other, but looking for the things that they all have in common. Um, the way that because that will give me a better idea of generally how fat is stored in the face and how it affects the shape of the face, rather than just what are the peculiarities of one person's um, facial structure. And once I've got those in my kind of bank of knowledge, then I can apply them to all different types of character drawings and everything. And it won't just look like I'm constantly drawing Sydney Greenstreet or Fats Waller. Um, the the shadow of or the shape rather, of what's called the nasolabial folds um, around the side of the mouth and up to the nose, those lines that lead from the nostril down to the corners of the mouth. Um, when a character smiles, or in fact, in a lot of contexts with a larger character like this, they have a slightly more square quality to the way that they contort around the face than you might expect. People generally tend to just draw them as either a basic curve or a kind of wave. But quite often because of the shape of the muscles which govern the movement of the mouth, there is a point at which the sort of middle of that line is kind of tethered to the cheekbone, and it creates this quite sharp corner in the shape of the nasolabial fold. Um, it's just another little observation, but it's one that again will make your faces seem more credible. You'll notice a lot of earlier illustrators use that. It's actually even people like Dudley D. Watkins and stuff cottoned onto it back in the kind of golden age of DC Thompson. Um, Hairline, I've chosen to kind of give this large character a receding hairline, which I guess is again playing to certain kinds of stereotypes, which aren't always the healthiest in a social context. But in this case, um, stereotypes in terms of creating facial types for your characters can be useful in that they give the viewer or reader rather again almost a kind of blank canvas of a character. You're only really giving them um, the information about the character that you feel they need to know by using very kind of generic and easily recognized proportions for the face. For certain areas, you can uh, you can communicate by exaggerating one aspect or highlighting one aspect, you can give the information that you want to know about, you want the reader to know about the character quite clearly. Because if only one aspect of a person's face, or a couple of aspects of their face, is not completely generic, then they know to kind of read into it. So in this instance, the character is going to be given a sort of kind of 1920s, 30s comb over, and a little kind of a little moustache, and he's already got his little kind of hawk-like nose, and those things, and his slightly arched eyebrows. Those things are the elements of this face, which are not just drawn on kind of classically proportioned elements. I mean, obviously, the fact that he's got a very large face, that's not a classical thing, but he has a very generic looking large face. You know, the proportions of it are consistent with how we expect a more heavy set person's face to look. So that means that anything that's contrary to that, or anything that's clearly distinct in its own right, will tell you something about the character. Now, while we're building up on this, here I'm just kind of going in and filling in a little bit of the anatomical details of the face and touching up some of the shading. So since there's not a huge amount to discuss about that specifically, I will go to my contingency, which is in order to better facilitate this video. I knew there was going to be maybe long various points where there was less notable things to talk about. So I put a request out there to people on Facebook to give me some questions about facial types, drawing different facial types that I could try and answer relatively successfully, and that might give us something interesting to discuss. Not discuss, obviously, because it's just going to be me talking, but something interesting to go into while I'm just kind of frittering about on the details of the face here. I didn't want to necessarily edit out this part of the video because, I mean, it does contain, you know, like an important stage of the evolution of the face, but a lot of it is a case of just refining rather than adding anything new. I mean, some details I am picking out that weren't picked out before, like I've shaded the cheek a little bit more there, a greater area of the cheek to show that is you know, that there is a kind of a bulge there, and that is the shadow from that bulge goes even so far as to eclipse one of the kind of natural gaps in shading on the face, which is that gap between the sort of nasolabial fold and the kind of dimple line. And I'm also putting a little bit of kind of forehead wrinkle in, just to add a little bit of expression. And that's all based on, you know, having some understanding of how the forehead wrinkles when it's sort of corrugated in different expressions and everything. Again, that's something that anatomy books aren't, well, or rather books on kind of muscular diagrams are not necessarily good for, because the way that the face corrugates while it's dictated by the muscle structure doesn't. It's the actual end effect is the way that the skin is responding to how the muscles in the forehead move. So you have to look to anatomy books that go into a little bit more depth on the kind of the way the flesh of the face moves. And there's some good ones. There's one called Atlas of Human Anatomy for the Artist that has some very good I think it's by Steve Rogers Peck, and it's got some very good diagrams of not just the face but all the kind of areas of the body pretty much, that show not just the musculature but also how the skin or the skin and fat surrounding it actually respond to different different kind of expressions and movements. Um, that there is one thing that I did there in terms of defining the face again, that's I suppose important, where I took the line at the bottom of the jaw here. I'm actually about to build into it a little bit more and create more of a um, sharp edge to the side of the face, more or less a straight line between the peak of the cheek on that side. There we go. I'm doing it now, and like quite a sharp corner from that to where the chin goes down to meet the neck. When an area of the face is in shadow like that, and sometimes even when it's not, it can be good to simplify the basic structures of the face. If you can find ways of creating a more a simpler and more kind of characteristic shape, rather than having lots of kind of curves and gullies in the outline of the face. It helps to give a strong silhouette and add a kind of add a more immediate character to the face that allows it to kind of jump off the page a little bit more. But anyway, let's go to some questions from Facebook and see what the good people are asking. This one, let's see, what are we going to have first? I think we're probably going to have one from Cameron Foster, who happens to be my brother. And his question is, does having your own face help with drawing others? Now, there are many disadvantages to having my face, but among the few advantages is that it does help with drawing others, because obviously I have an instant reference. I can just take a mirror and I can scowl or scream or or evoke any emotion which I may already be feeling anyway, and immediately see how that affects the face. It's very good for eye wrinkles and things. I am in the unfortunate position, though, that many people, particularly in this country, find themselves in, of having a beard, and that does compromise my initial reference for facial anatomy, because so much of my face is lost to hair. But generally speaking, the majority of people that I'm familiar with agree that it's worth the sacrifice. It's better for society as a whole if more of my face is obscured. Let's see if we've got another question here. Just going in and peaking the eyebrows a little bit, adding a little bit of individual hairs there to pick out the kind of expressive qualities. Also, very clearly blocking in the shadow of that upper lip, as I described before, and kind of pursing the lips a little bit by adding a harder edge to the shadow on the lower lip. Let's see if we've got any more questions from Facebook. Do you think that having a knowledge of phrenology helps in making the reader aware of who the criminals are in the story before the dialogue might give them away? That one's from Niall McGalloway. That's a very good question. Obviously, phrenology is a time-honoured tradition rather than a science. And as I mentioned before, the social politics of trying to give cues as to what a person's moral compass might be based on their facial anatomy are arguably poorly founded. But there are other ways to suggest criminality than purely by bone structure. In this instance, this character seems to have a fairly nefarious quality, but I've achieved that not so much because he's fat, as by the fact that I've given him a kind of, a slightly greasy, uneasy kind of quality to his hair. The little moustache is very evocative of, you know villains of silent movies and everything. Trying to suggest, um, not necessarily evil, but an element of chicanery without without being downright offensive in doing so. Um, Again, the just picking out some of the adding shadow to the contours of the head where it sort of starts to curve away from the light source. It's easy to forget that although the top of the dominant area of the top of the head is facing the light, towards the edges of it, it is of course curving away from it. So a little bit of shading just around the edges there helps to define it as a three-dimensional object. Um, let's see what else we've got from Facebook. Another one from Cameron Foster. Say you're on the space station Mir and you're in a competition to draw your third favourite Jim Carrey performance before the other cosmonauts. Is that an ace-face race in space? The answer to that, unlike most questions an artist might be posed, is a very simple yes or no. You don't get very many yes or no questions as an artist, but this one is. I'm not going to say which it is though. That part you have to figure out for yourself. Again, adding a little bit of atmosphere and mood to the image just by creating an impression of an underlying figure for context. A strong shadow for the ear is usually quite a good idea because the ear sort of does stick out from the head fairly uh, more than almost any other feature of the face. And just kind of, again, making those lines kind of raggedy in order to create the impression that they were created using something other than, MS Paint. That's something about rendering in Photoshop actually, with very simple means, which can be quite effective, is that you can just go in and put in an area of hatching and then hack away at it either with the eraser tool or just with the paintbrush tool, but with white paint, and create a kind of a lively non-uniform line that, while not entirely similar to ink, has its own kind of interesting quality and a kind of randomness and gestural quality. There's very few lines on this face that have survived intact from how they were drawn at first, you'll notice, and that's no accident. That's a very conscious thing. As soon as you see one of those round-ended brush lines, immediately you think that was drawn on a computer. So just by kind of scoring away at them and eroding them, you can create quite a sort of striking impression of something very different. In this case, almost like an etching. There, I'm just picking out very subtly the edge of the nose because I want quite a defined hard edge to the side of the nose, and even though it's facing the light, just adding a very, very subtle couple of dots to suggest it can help give the object, in this case the nose, a nice sense of dimension without ruining the lighting and the consistency of that. Let's see if we've got any more questions from Facebook. Jack asks, I'm not very good at drawing faces. Is there a market for comics without faces? Also without dialogue or hands? Well, there's a market for just about everything, Jack. Particularly in comics. You'll find that traditional narrative elements are often absent from many indie and even mainstream titles. and that even people who are forced to incorporate things like hands and and faces and dialogue um, uh, are not particularly adept at doing so. So you find yourself in good company there. Um, it's uh, it's always a challenge when you've got one particular obstacle in your way, but I don't see any reason why you should be discouraged by your uh, virtually total lack of drawing ability. Um, Now, saving this one and moving on to our third facial type, which in this case is a sort of wizened character, somebody a bit more weathered, who's seen some bad times, let's say. Um, Certainly has probably seen plenty of time. This is very much a kind of uh, Adrian Toombs, aka the Vulture slash character, although obviously for legal reasons is in no way related to Adrian Toombs, aka the Vulture. Um, but you will notice on me leaning fairly heavily on similar elements in the basic architecture of his face. Although I think towards the end I do kind of veer away from that a bit. Now this is a more difficult one because here you are exaggerating the face beyond what is typically considered to be realistic. A far bigger nose, uh, probably, you know, a sort of a more kind of caved in jawline and exposed musculature and wrinkles on the face than would necessarily be realistic. So for this example, uh, I am relying very heavily on a more academic understanding of how the face is constructed. It's 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 a tough one to give tips on, very specific tips on, because so much of it is determined um, uh, by building up a very large catalogue of of knowledge of how specific areas of the face are structured and how they react to light and all those types of things. But I suppose the key thing is when you're drawing a face of this type, have your anatomy drawings, have your uh, reference of more unusual faces as close as you can to the facial type that you're going for on hand. Tend more towards the anatomy drawings because they will give you the tools to create something uh, which no photo reference really will. No face is going to look quite like this in real life. So you just need to kind of, I was going to say you just need to trust your understanding of facial anatomy, but I would say actually do the opposite. Don't trust your understanding of facial anatomy, um, because nobody's understanding of facial anatomy is perfect. Certainly not to the extent where they can extemporize on it at will with flawless accuracy. So always consult your reference material, because it will give you enough, hopefully give you enough that you can build something that is credible. In this case, every line pretty much on this face is delineating something that is genuine of facial anatomy. All those lines on the cheeks are delineating specific things, specific muscles in the cheeks, and specific patterns in the way that the skin that leads from the sort of hollow between the eye and the nose down the side of the face to the mouth. Um, all those things are fairly anatomically consistent in all facial types. Um, so kind of hacking away at those until the bare elements are more exposed is a good way to give your character a kind of rough and weathered look, um, beyond what is really realistic. I mean, obviously, a particularly ancient person might have a lot of these things exposed, but then a particularly ancient person would also have, you know, incredibly huge bags under the eyes and really, really loose skin around the jaw and everything. Whereas in this case, you're kind of picking out the key elements that you want to age and weather. Oh well, apologies for that slight sound edit there. It seems I can only record a maximum of 60 minutes of sound on this before it automatically stops. But we're back now in full force. Um, I was discussing about how you can specifically target areas to age and kind of well, I suppose weather is the term, really, isn't it? And wear down to give your character a sense of being kind of wind beaten and wizened. Uh, in this case, we're keeping a fairly sort of sharp chin, sharp cheekbones. We're not allowing the face to sag as a whole, so it doesn't appear that our character is necessarily approaching death in just through sheer decrepitude, but we're exposing a lot of the musculature of the cheeks. We're exposing a lot of um, the tendons and arteries and muscles in the neck. We're corrugating the forehead quite violently, adding a lot of wrinkles. I will be adding some significant crow's feet um, and and kind of adding a little bit of texture to the end of the nose there to give it a sort of rougher quality. Still observing the rules of form, though. I mean, all those areas of texture and line are consistent with the greater shadows of the like the substructures of the face and the overall face itself. Um, just here, sort of dealing with a couple of the niceties. Well, in this case, trying to make the neck, trying to give the neck a kind of believable bend without actually having uh, fleshed in the rest of the anatomy. Um, a nice big ear there as well, just to give our character that sort of. That's another age element. The ears and the nose tend to get bigger as you go on, so that's a kind of characterful one, but without giving your character the sort of debility that a tremendous amount of age brings. Picking out the bags under the eyes and the crow's feet there, just to kind of accentuate the more expressive elements of the aging process. Um, and now you'll notice that was one of the rare examples there where I actually used the undo tool to delete a line after I drew it. I'm only really doing that um, for specific outlines of things. Anything that's regarding um, more kind of shading and rendering, I'm tending to draw and then, if I'm not happy with the line, partially erase, because that will give us a more textured look towards the end. One of the downfalls of digital art is often that you have too much recourse to undo what you've done, and therefore the finished drawing, however um, accurate and complete it may look, doesn't have the additional texture and kind of atmosphere in the air that you get from having made a whole bunch of mistakes and worked over them or worked around them. Um, that's not just a kind of purist artist thing of the joys of doing things traditionally. It is in fact quite an important factor in giving an image visual depth, because there are all kinds of things which add texture to objects which you don't even consider when you're drawing them. Even from dust in the air to the pores of the skin. Everything has sort of textures and atmospheric elements that you can't really account for um, just off the top of your head, no matter how well you plan it. So in order to have everything being looking very kind of clinical and sterile, it can be it can actually aid the process to have imperfections in how you got there, because every error that you've worked over or had to fix has its little relics that give that add texture and depth to the image. Uh, Now, while we're filling in some of those shadows there, I mean, a lot of these points we've covered already in terms of the things that determine the way that the shadows fall on the face, about how it's how it's all one three-dimensional form that reacts to light as such. So since we've covered some of that ground already, let's go back to Facebook and see if there are any more questions to answer from my adoring public. Let's see. Okay, here's another one from Cameron. It says, say you're drawing a face in a comic, but the guy who's telling the story is a racist. Do you have to draw more racist? And do you find that harder or easier? Well, typically, as we've touched on, I and several of the comic book artists use stereotypes of one type or another very heavily in comics as it is. Perhaps more than we ought to. So I wouldn't say any of us have any great difficulty in incorporating a sense of social prejudice into our work. But generally speaking, the greater challenge is to create, is to avoid being too stereotypical in your approach, or at least in avoiding harmful stereotypes anyway. In this instance, much as in the last one, I'm trying not to lean on the kind of idea of age affording a character a degree of additional unpleasantness, and instead trying to suggest that any unpleasantness that's present in the character is more the result of circumstances. That sounds like a fairly complex idea to get across in in a single drawing of a face, but if you kind of texture the face appropriately and exaggerate the correct elements, then you can suggest that a character is maybe the way they are as a product of how their kind of life has gone up until that point, rather than just that they have had a certain amount of it. Again, working away, eroding some of the lines to give a better sense of texture to the face. In this instance, I'm doing it. I'm kind of cutting into those areas of shadow and leaving some of those round edge lines, because I mean, I will ultimately go on to kind of nuance them a little bit, but it can give the impression, if you have an area of shadow towards the lower half of the face, if you've got a character like this who has got kind of a rough face, and you want to suggest, maybe a little bit kind of like an unshaven quality, then going in and if you're working traditionally, then going in with a very sharp edge of an eraser, or if you've got a good uh, sort of eraser pen, going in and just picking into the shadow a little bit, and sort of almost hatching into it the way you would with the black into the white areas, then you can give a quite nice a suggestion of sort of stubble and just general kind of roughness of the face. It's used to great effect in The Killing Joke, actually, where Brian Bolland has the scenes of Commissioner Gordon being kind of psychologically tortured by the Joker. You will notice, if you study those drawings of Commissioner Gordon's face closely, that Brian Bolland has done just that, and he has not necessarily done it with an eraser, but he's gone in and broken up the jawline with little white kind of flicks, just to suggest that by this point the commissioner has developed a considerable 5 o'clock shadow, and that adds to the sort of to the stress and sense of duress in that scene. Again, just going in and tightening up some of the shading. A lot of this is sort of is a bit instinctive. It's difficult to give you a definitive guide on exactly how much is too much shadow to put on the face. It's a result of just studying lots and lots of reference for a long time and drawing the face a lot. So I would always recommend doing that as much as possible. So let's see if there's any more questions to field while we get towards the end of this one. Let's see. Oh, I don't know if we do have any more on facial anatomy or different facial types. Well, that's fine, because we are approaching the end of this session. We've got a little while left to go, but most of that will be taken up with sort of wrapping up some of the fundamentals here. Again, I've picked out a few lines on the hairs on the eyebrows there, just to give a sense of kind of to arch them a little bit and give a sense of immediacy to the expression. Picked out the temple line a little bit. Again, it's facing the light, so you don't want to pick it out too much. But again, just a sort of suggestion of the edge of the temple will help give the face a sense of dimension. And I have broken it up with a big area of highlight here, and I'm doing it even more so there, in order to make sure that the face is consistent in terms of 3 dimensions. You'll notice that there is quite a bit of work gone into doing the kind of muscles and skin around the mouth and shading those as accurately as possible. That's something that you will develop from studying the way that the face kind of contorts when it's in certain expressions. It's something that is a wee bit too detailed to go into the moment. Although there are those kind of slight slugs of slugs of flesh. Sounds like an incredibly unappealing term to use, but it's almost like a skin moustache that goes from the nostril down to the corner of the mouth on each side of the mouth, and when the face is grimacing like that, it tends to bulge a little bit, and towards the edges of the mouth, the corners of the mouth, because they are recessed by grimacing, you do get a greater shadow around the sides of the mouth, and you'll find that does eclipse again some of the facial anatomy, and create like a broader shadow around where the mouth meets the jaw. Again, just giving a sort of a slight sense of context by building in some shadows and just to sort of try and sell the face as not just a 3-dimensional object, but a 3-dimensional object in some kind of context. I think at this point, most of the anatomy is pretty well and pretty clearly plotted out. You can see around the edge of the sort of the jawline there, where it comes up towards the ear, I've broken up the outline of the jaw completely into just individual little flicks of lines, again to suggest stubble. When you destroy the kind of integrity of the outline of the image, as I think I'm about to do even further with the top of the head as well, it does give a sense of texture to the character. Any erosion to the line work will do that usually. It's quite a different way from the way that I would work if I was working in ink, because in ink I'm trying to be as clean and disciplined as possible, whereas when I'm working in Photoshop, I'm almost trying to do the opposite, because each has its own elements that you have to compensate for. Ink is an unforgiving and messy medium, so trying to be as disciplined in it as possible can counteract some of the disadvantages of working in it. Whereas when you're working on the computer, that's a very kind of safe environment and a very sterile environment to produce art. So messing it up a little bit by being a bit more ragged and a bit more sketchy can enhance the visuals. There is a danger when digitally inking that your lines are almost too perfect. A lot of work that's produced in like Manga Studio, for example, is very good, but sometimes when it's translated to the printed page, you do feel it does feel a little too digital. It feels a little too governed by the kind of presets and sort of safeguards of the software that allow you to dictate exactly how even a line weight will be, and everything. Whereas when you have to actually attempt to maintain an even line weight when you're using a brush, you will get natural imperfections in it, which lend it again some sense of texture and therefore dimension and depth. In this instance, I'm actually quite pleased with how the drawing has come out as an atmospheric piece, I suppose, which I wouldn't normally be with a digital drawing done quite quickly. But I think in this case, I've really made an effort to create a sense of texture by destroying the integrity of some of those lines. So it's always worth having a go, and that applies to digital painting as well as digital drawing. It's very easy to get comfortable in a world of layers and filters and forget that the real world is not as clean and efficient as that. That almost seems like a moralist point, and that's not what it's intended to be. I mean, I like clean, attractive visuals. My inking style when I work traditionally is very it's certainly geared towards being very clean and very kind of finished looking. But even just things like the texture of paper and the imperfections in the scanning process and all those things can lend just that extra little subtle element of texture which you don't get when working digitally. So you do have to account for that in some way if you want your work to have a kind of worked into and visually interesting look, so it doesn't just look like a kind of generic piece of digital art, which is not to denigrate digital art as an art form, but it just every art form or every medium has its downside, and that's the one downside of working digitally, is that it's very easy to become is to lose the kind of accidentals. Just working these up here to create a little kind of montage image to use as the main image in the body of the article, just to illustrate the distinctiveness of these three faces from each other. This is there's very little craft that's going into this process, but often by sort of like, without wanting to use too arty, and I use the term arty in the pejorative sense, without wanting to use too arty a term. If you juxtapose things like this, then you do sometimes get a better sense of if you're creating genuinely distinct characters, or if they do all look a little bit like they come out from the same mold. One thing which I should mention, which I kind of forgot to touch on, was that when shading the face, shading the particularly the bigger forms of the face, which don't necessarily have a huge amount of um, innate texture, such as the skin on the like the forehead, around the temples, things like that, on the cheeks and things that seem quite smooth when you look at them. Your lines that you use for rendering, it can be very helpful if you keep them fairly kind of omnidirectional. If you've got something that is, try and have them in a direction that is consistent with the light source. Either have them go in the same direction as the light source, or the exact opposite direction of the light source, but it should in some way be kind of consistent with the light source. That will help sell it as a three-dimensional image. If you're trying to, if your lines are going in all different directions, then it will compromise how three-dimensional the face looks. But if you, like for example, most of the lines which shade the face on the first two, or the leftermost two faces in this image here, are going from the top left corner down to the bottom right. There are exceptions. The lines which delineate the nose, or which shade the nose on the left hand side character, and some of the lines around the neck and everything. Those, because they are shading more textured and more sort of smaller, more focused forms, then you can have those lines kind of bend around to be consistent with the forms that you're trying to convey. But with it works like lips as well, because the lips have those natural grooves in them. Those function quite well as having their own inbuilt kind of texture to them. Whereas, like I say, with smoother surfaces, that's where you want to use your lines that are consistent in their direction. Anyway, the end approacheth now, so I better wrap this up. Thanks very much for joining me for this facial types tutorial. I hope I've been of some use. If not, then I apologise for wasting quite so much of your time. But happy drawing, and I'll see you next time. So thanks very much. Goodbye.